I can jump on that risk question for a second, not so much about return on investment or how much, but if I want to drill down on that for just a second, that's something I'm very curious about. I work closely with one of the founding funds of the Seed Commons and been watching it evolve over about 8, 9 years now, watching that whole model develop. And I've been sort of wondering, are we now or will we soon be at the point where we have a strong enough case where there's enough history, there's enough evidence, there's enough statistical analysis, we can look at it and we can actually say, here is the actual risk of, for example, investing in worker co-ops, investing in these funds that invest in worker co-ops, that loan to worker co-ops. Are we in a position to see what the loss rate is, what the default rate is, what the, not just the amount of return on investment, but, what the real risk is? Do we have, are we there yet in terms of the documentation, or do we still have a ways to go before we have, sort of irrefutable evidence of what the risk actually is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd be curious how fund managers themselves, like Seed Commons, would answer the question. My sense is that in certain areas or in certain types of investments, we do have a track record. Say, startup co-ops that need, loans of, $100 to $250,000 to get started. We've collectively, as a co-op financing movement, we do have enough deals that we could look at and say, okay, here's how many loans defaulted, here's how these businesses grew, here's how many shut down after 5 years. We should have that data. I think there's a couple constraints that I would really love to see fixed, which some folks like the Worker to Owners Initiative, folks like Dowie and Democracy at Work Institute are doing really good work on. But I think more needs to be done to collect that data and synthesize it to tell that story. But I think there's reasons that some funds don't want to share it, right? They have some of that proprietary information, some term sheets and legal documents that they might not necessarily want to share. But there's definitely a need to collect that data. But when we zoom out from just that kind of like startup co-op investment, I think there's a couple other contexts that also have a lot of track record. ESOP financing, there's been a lot of, and there is actually plenty of data on risk and firm success and productivity and all that that I've seen. The National Center for Employee Ownership and Rutgers University does a lot of data collection on that. So I would say in certain areas, there is a very clear case. It's there. We might need to collect, synthesize more of the data, but, it's out there. But there's really a lot of new and emerging models and financing models that are still untested. And I think it's really important to continue to test those. A very important factor in all of this is that, as these new funds that are mission focused are emerging, and new strategies and old strategies, even this is the case for co-op lenders too, is they need philanthropic dollars to help, pay for staff, to go into businesses for TA providers to provide support. There's a whole network of organizations that help build ownership culture and help get access to legal services and government services and all that. There's a lot of philanthropic grant dollars that need to go into this because it is mission oriented. And I think a lot of people use that as a knock against the movement to say, oh, it's actually, it can only be philanthropically supported. That makes it risky. It's not competing fairly, quote unquote, with the traditional business space. But I actually think that is totally not true. If you look at the way that our policies are set up and the way that our financial system operates, there's so many loopholes and benefits and dollars that are available for traditional enterprises, especially the most extractive kinds, like private equity, they have tons of incentives and tax breaks from the government to do the kind of financing they do. I think in my vision of how cooperatives and other alternative ownership enterprises scale is, yes, we need to have funding from philanthropy to do the research to support the early movers and build that base so we can show that it's not risky. But over time, I think the policy becomes more and more important as we try to scale, because otherwise we're not going to be able to compete in the market with traditional finance.
That's very encouraging. Thank you. I look forward to getting stronger data, particularly in the co-op side and particularly in the worker co-op side. I look forward to us getting more and more ability to make the case. Whatever the risk is, being able to firmly document that risk, I think, could unlock a lot. People can sort of qualify and quantify the risk in a reliable way. Anyway, I don't want to dominate. I may have other follow-up questions, but thank you for that.
I have more questions, but Josh, you haven't.
Go for it, Matt. Nope.
You sure? So Curt, I think I'm feeling like, oh, okay, maybe tell me if this is a correct understanding of a very simple expression of kind of what the strategy is. So I've been translating this work by this guy, Luis Raceto, who's like a Chilean writer on solidarity economy. And he emphasizes in talking about cooperative economics, the goal in a cooperative is for capital accumulation to be internal as much as possible and increasingly internal. Like you don't want external capital. All the capital that's accumulated ideally should be generated internally. And anything that's external, you want to internalize. You don't want to keep a presence of a lot of external capital in your business. You want to kind of get rid of that. So it seems like what you're describing, for example, in terms of conversions, where there's a huge need for capital to pay off the previous owners, that I could see sort of a concept of capital coming in to facilitate this process of the workers getting ownership. And then ultimately the external capital should be reduced to zero. Mm-hmm. And ultimately meaning in shorter term than 1,000 years, like ultimately meaning relatively soon. Is that an accurate description of sort of the strategy of this? Is it to have capital? Is capital the idea that you're investing only to facilitate a process where you are going to have no role, like you're not going to be involved in that financially or in other forms?
Yeah, for the most part, that's where most of the activity that we see in the field is in that conversion process. And you're right. The whole conversion process, it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of parallels with the leverage buyouts that private equity funds do, where you get a loan or you get debt capital from a variety of sources, could be a bank, and use that money to pay out the existing owner of the business. And then over time, the company pays back that loan through profits. That's a very simple form, but eventually you want to pay off that loan so that you don't have that debt on your balance sheet. But there's a lot of different ways that we see this happening. And one really important factor to consider is the selling owner typically wants to get out as fast as possible, right? If you're retiring, you've run a business for, many years, some are willing to remain involved in some way, might take a board seat as their, essentially it's called seller financing, as their loan is getting paid back. But it's much more attractive if you can go to an owner and say, hey, we'll buy you out day one, and then we'll manage the balance sheet of the loan. So there are some new financing models that are emerging to figure that out in a way that gives that owner that liquidity up front. That's super important.